this is just the beginning.
Welcome to the Future of Financial Inclusion, our virtual event. I'm Dan Primack, business editor at Axios, coming to you from my home in Southborough, Massachusetts. A huge thank you to Visa for making this conversation possible, and welcome to our audiences on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, LinkedIn, and of course, Axios.com. Please follow along using the hashtag Axios Events and at Axios on Twitter. Over the next 30 minutes, we're going to discuss the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, uneven access to technology, and the role of systemic racism in growing economic inequality. And our first guest is the senator from the great state of Minnesota, Senator Tina Smith, joining us from Washington, D.C. Senator.
How do you do, Dan? It's great to be with you.
Thank you, and you're a great person to have for this, not only obviously because you're a sitting U.S. senator, but you chair the banking committee and also were a small business owner in your prior life. So let's start with the news of the day, which is the big $1.9 trillion COVID stimulus part 3 that the president is trying to get through right now. Obviously, lots of parts to it, but when you think of issues of financial inclusion, talk to me about what you think this proposal could do.
Well, we know that before the COVID pandemic, we've seen deep inequities and access to home ownership, access to wealth, wage inequality, employment inequality between Black and Brown and Indigenous people and white people in this country. And what's happened is that the COVID pandemic has exacerbated that. It has made those differences even deeper. So there's an opportunity for us as we are responding to the public health and economic emergency of COVID to address those systemic inequalities. And first, we have to kind of get everybody through this crisis, but then we have to look towards how we build forward and how we improve. And in this package that President Biden has proposed and that we are already getting to work on in the Senate, there are some things that we can do to address the emergencies that people are experiencing right now. And here's just one example. You think about the challenges that people have staying in their homes if you've lost your income, more likely to be an African American, and you need some help right now. That is your primary source of wealth. We can take steps right now to protect that wealth building and people's home ownership.
Can I ask kind of a real politics political question about that? That seems to be something, correct me if I'm wrong, that there's bipartisan support for, more eviction moratoriums, et cetera. One of the things at least that Biden's talking about that there isn't bipartisan consensus on is increasing the minimum wage to $15, which certainly would decrease economic inequality. Do you believe that that's actually going to be part of any package that gets passed by the Senate?
I believe that there's a lot of us that will fight really hard for that. And it's interesting because raising the minimum wage is one of to $15 an hour, it raises over time. So it gets to $15 an hour by 2025 is one of the biggest things that we can do to address the wage inequality and savings potential for people of color in this country. It's broadly popular in this country. It just isn't broadly popular amongst Republicans in the Senate. So I think that that's a conversation that we're going to have, and I hope that we can find some agreement there.
One of the other things you proposed last fall, alongside co-sponsored in the Senate with Sherrod Brown, is this bill, a banking bill, to eliminate, I guess you could say, discrimination when it comes to customer access to banks and other financial institutions, stuff that I guess was not explicitly written out in the Civil Rights Act. Talk to me a little bit about why you feel this bill is important and why you're working on it.
Well, I'm thinking about conversations I have with a woman who I spend a lot of time with when I'm home in Minnesota, who she's a Black woman, has told me numerous times about going to local banks where she literally has a savings account to cash a check, a personal check, and they refuse to cash the check for her. Now, in that circumstance, it's hard not to see that as anything but racial profiling. Holding her back, keeping her from exercising the same kind of banking that we, white people honestly take for granted. What the bill that Sherrod Brown has that I am co-leading with him would do is it would bring under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, banking and financial services, prohibiting discrimination in banking and financial services. So right now what happens is my friend Joni, who goes to cash that check, doesn't really have a very good recourse. As long as that bank ultimately cashes the check, she has no way of really getting a satisfaction for the inconvenience and the discrimination that she experienced.
That's interesting. Where is that in process, and what do you think that? I assume, because understanding the way you guys work there, things don't often pass on their own as piece of legislation. They have to get tied to other things. Where is that bill in process?
Yeah, well, you're right. Sometimes we have to bundle things together so that we can move them through the Senate. We are just starting a new Congress, and so that piece of legislation needs to be reintroduced. Fundamentally, we have to kind of start over again. But there's a big difference because now Senator Brown is the chair of the Banking Committee rather than the ranking member. And I know that addressing this kind of discrimination in financial services and creating more opportunities for people of color to get access to banking services, loans, access to capital is a big priority for us as we move into the majority.
So right, and there's kind of these two parts, right? Which is, one is discrimination, like your friend, at the teller counter, and then there's kind of more proactive inclusion. And when you think about so much more of financial services moving online, moving onto our phones, somebody actually, this was an audience question. Somebody I think who works at a fintech company, at a payment processing company, asked, "What do you believe the fintech world can do to promote inclusion when it comes to financial services, not just not discriminate?"
Yeah, well, one thing that can happen is that the fintech world can promote access to those services across barriers and differences, and that would make a big difference. We also have to. I honestly think that our regulatory structures need to catch up with the innovation that we're seeing in fintech, so that people understand what kind of protections they're getting or not getting if they are doing a financial transaction through a bank where their savings, for example, are protected, versus in a fintech world where there might be different regulatory structures and the protections might be the same. So part of this is making sure that people have the knowledge that they need so that they know what they're getting and also that they have access.
I wonder, from a practical perspective, how do you do that? Because every time we download an app or accept it, there's a terms of service, and we all hit accept, and they're massive, and none of us read them. So that information might be, technically provided, but how do you actually get somebody to get it in some sort of digestible format?
Well, I mean, it's such a good point, and I don't want anybody to think that I'm directly criticizing any particular app, but I mean, we all know that sometimes those apps seems to be designed for opacity rather than clarity, and so that makes it that much harder. So I think this is something that we have to really dive into, and I don't have any specific prescriptions right now other than to say that I think we ought to look about kind of how people opt in versus opt out of information, and just take some steps to make it a little bit easier for people to actually understand what it is that they're getting and what they're not getting.
It's part also, as we said, with so much more stuff moving online, there is still a digital divide in America, particularly, maybe you could argue more almost now a smartphone divide than anything else when it comes to this. Is there a case to be made, and we've talked about this on prior Axios virtual events, that broadband access should be viewed by, maybe I guess you could say, local and state legislatures more like a utility like water and electricity than the service that it currently is viewed as?
Well, I think of broadband as the fundamental infrastructure of the 21st century. And just as in the first part of the 20th century, we had a broad-based strategy to get electricity to every single house in this country so that when you turn the light switch on, no matter where you live, the power went on. I think we need that same kind of national strategy to get to broadband. We have spent billions of dollars in this country trying to expand broadband, and we're doing it through a public-private partnership, which frankly I support. But I think that the need is so great. And this is not only a rural-urban issue, because I know a lot of people who live in urban communities who, especially during COVID, have struggled with access to broadband. If you can't afford broadband in your apartment in a big city and you rely on going to the local library or the local cafe, but that cafe is closed because of COVID, you have fundamentally been excluded from educational opportunities and employment opportunities and healthcare opportunities, and in some cases financial opportunities, banking opportunities.
Senator Tina Smith, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you.
And I'm now going to turn it over to Axios CEO and my boss, Jim Vandehei, for a view from the top.
Thank you very much, Dan. I really appreciate it. Now it's my pleasure to bring you a conversation with Charlotte Hogg, who's the Executive Vice President and Chief Executive Officer of Europe for Visa. Charlotte, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
This whole this whole program is about financial inclusion. To you, what is financial exclusion? Like, who is excluded?
It's an important question, because I think with the changes we've seen in the pandemic, you almost have to begin to look at this question a little bit differently. Because what's happened over the last year now is that we've seen a really significant move into digital, certainly in our world, in payments. And that means what it takes to be excluded and what it is to be excluded has changed as well. Historically in financial services, we thought about accessibility, but we didn't always include digital with that. I think nowadays we have to think about inclusion as being digitally financially included, whether it's small businesses who I think are increasingly important in driving towards a more inclusive recovery and who need to be digitally enabled to participate in that, I think, or whether it's consumers who, for various reasons, may be vulnerable, maybe shielding, need to have digital solutions as well as physical ones when it comes to financial services. So one of the things we have to do, and you always have to do with any of these kind of changes, is to think about which groups have potentially been left behind by a certain change and how to think about how to bring them in, which is why Visa are doing a ton of work on thinking about particularly small businesses, but also those who've been made more vulnerable through this pandemic. And it's good to see the innovation supporting that too.
And how does that work? Because I would think with COVID in particular, now people can't physically go visit a financial institution, a bank, go see people in person. So they're having to do it digitally. And on the one hand, you as someone running a company, you can offer the product, but if they don't have either the savvy or even the connectivity to do it, they can't connect with you. So how do you think about that? How do you tackle that problem that has several ends to it?
It's important. And the thing about payments, it's at the essence of all financial services. If you think about it, it was the origin of money is what enabled us to buy and sell across borders and outside where we could physically reach. So it's a very important question for payments. And as I said, there's been some really brilliant innovations. So for example, for those individuals who maybe haven't been able to leave home for the last number of months, actually being able to send others out to shop for you, but through the use of prepaid cards and controls, knowing that they can only spend your money in a certain way. Or in Spain, we've done some really important work with La Caixa, which is when physical food banks couldn't exist anymore, enabling virtual ones. So giving people prepaid cards that allows them to shop at supermarkets to buy food when the virtual food banks weren't open. Or take the small business space. Small businesses have seen a rate of closure, always have done, higher than others. Increasingly, they need to take digital payments when not all their customers can come to their door. So those are all the different ways I think you can think about an ecosystem of payments enabling digital inclusion, digital financial inclusion in a world that's changed for many of us so fundamentally.
I think all of us running companies have had to make changes because of COVID that we're like, why didn't I do that pre-COVID? It's such a nice improvement either for the company or the customer. What are the things you've done at Visa that you're most proud of that you probably wouldn't have done at least this fast if it weren't for the coronavirus and the changes that it spawned?
I think the truly extraordinary thing was how, for all of us and globally, our technology support, both for us working as individuals and for the system as a whole, which is a truly immense and important infrastructure, worked so seamlessly. I mean, one of the dogs that didn't bark really through this whole crisis is that the digital forms and our digital payment solutions have not missed a beat. Now, that's extraordinary, really, in a world where globally people have been affected at different times and people have been working from home. So actually, the extraordinary thing is the thing we don't always talk about is how well everything has worked, not just in our business, but in our clients' businesses as well. And that business has gone on, consumers have been able to buy the essential things of life, and small businesses and big businesses have been able to provide that for them. It's actually amazing.
And for those of us who maybe don't spend as much time as you do in Europe and back in the States, like, what are the big differences when you think about inclusion or exclusion? Are there big differences between the work you have to do in Europe or the work that Visa would have to do in America?
I mean, the striking thing actually is how consumers have all responded in quite similar ways across the world. So this embracing of digital, this move to contactless forms of payments, and for us in Europe, 80% of payments are now contactless. The embracing of e-commerce, that's actually consistent throughout the world. The focus on small businesses, who could be the sector that is the sector that is less digitally enabled when we started, is also a global priority. So globally, we committed to support the digitalization of 50 million small businesses. That's 8 million in Europe is our commitment. But it was our recognition that this was a vitally important sector of the economy, employs well over half the labor force in most developed countries, and really needs a focus in order to bring it through and to help with recovery country after country, wherever you look.
And Charlotte, as we wrap up, what so many things in business or in our lives are just being sped up because of the coronavirus, things that might have taken a decade, take a year. For me, like the end user of a card, like what has been sped up? Like what is the biggest, most profound reality for the user, for the average consumer that we're just going to have quicker than we thought we would have had before because of everything that's happened the last year or so?
So the big thing in payments is this shift to digital wherever you look. So first of all, I suspect in the US and definitely around the world, you're using tap to pay more than you ever were. And consumers and businesses have embraced that, a way of not touching when you go in to buy the things that you have to do. So that's one thing that is huge. It's grown 10 percentage points across Europe this year. It's now 80%, as I said. The second thing is, and certainly around the world, the use of mobile, which is supported by these encryption tokens that make it even more secure, that is beginning to increase. And then the real story, of course, is people shifting to digital forms of payments and sort of the model of e-commerce looking differently. I suspect, when you think about when you shop these days, sometimes you'll call ahead and click and collect. Sometimes you'll go to the store maybe, and sometimes you'll go online. But that kind of experience is beginning to bleed into one another, and the kind of bright divide between going into a shop physically and shopping online is really beginning to blur. And you see increasing innovation to support consumers having a whole range of experiences in that space. I mean, the pace of change has been very significant. I mean, we see 14% increase year on year at the moment in the use of e-commerce. So that is the big thematic, and it cuts across all sectors and all forms of spend.
Charlotte Hogg, we appreciate the conversation. We appreciate Visa making this broader conversation about financial inclusion possible. So thank you, and back to you, Dan.
Our final guest this afternoon is the president and CEO of the Institute for Women's Policy Research, C. Nicole Mason, joining us from Washington, D.C. Hi, Nicole.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Thank you so much for joining. Nicole, I want to start with this thing you wrote last summer. You termed what was happening in the economy as a she-cession, a play on recession, and a bit of a play on man-cession, which was talked about after the financial crisis a decade ago. Let's just start big picture. Why has what's happened with the pandemic been particularly tough on women?
So the reason why the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on women is because they are more likely to be employed in the hardest hit sectors this time around. So the service sector, leisure, hospitality, education, and the healthcare sector have been really impacted by the economic downturn, and women are concentrated in those sectors. So when we think about the economic downturn this time, it is disproportionately impacting women in terms of job losses as well as income losses.
So can you and I know I'm asking you for numbers, you don't have them in front of you, but but ballpark, give me a sense on, at least in terms of job losses, kind of what's happened with women compared to men over the past, whatever it's been, 12 months or almost 12 months since the pandemic hit.
So since the start of the pandemic, women have exited the workforce at 4 times the rate of men. So about 11 million women since the start of the pandemic have lost their jobs or exited the workforce. And when we look at in September and August, 865,000 women exited the workforce. And if we can understand that is the time when schools were set to open and daycares were open, and many women the burden of caretaking responsibilities as well as full-time work was a bit too much to bear.
So if 2020 was a she session, from what you've seen so far and what you're anticipating, we're only in the big, kind of middle of January, is 2021 going to be a she recovery?
We hope that it's going to be a she recovery, but to be honest, in December, we saw that 140,000 jobs were lost. Men gained jobs, but women did not. And women lost all the jobs in December. And I want to drill down a little bit more. All the job losses were women of color, Black and Latino women, to be really specific. So
you talked about Go ahead.
So I was just going to say that although we are really hoping for a she recovery, but it's going to really take getting the pandemic under control, getting schools opened, and also really working hard to get women back to work.
So you talked about one of the things driving this being really kind of sector specific. For example, hospitality, being an area where women and women of color are kind of disproportionately present in the workforce. Obviously, those are some of the sectors, or is a sector that's been particularly devastated. Is it as simple as getting the pandemic under control and getting people back out to restaurants and in hotels? Is that really kind of what we're waiting for? Or is there some sort of middle step, economic step, maybe something you're seeing in the new stimulus package that can kind of bridge us to that?
Well, I think the $1.9 trillion package is really a great step in the right direction. There are a lot of things in there that will benefit workers and also small businesses. So one of the things that we have to do, we got to get the pandemic under control, but we have to make sure that small business are able to stay afloat until we get a handle on the pandemic. And some of the supports in the recovery package will help us to do that. Another huge factor in terms of getting women back to work is making sure that schools are able to open. And, in the beginning of the pandemic, there was not enough attention paid to the impact of school closures on women's ability to work and stay in the workforce. And now we know better. And so we really are turning our focus there because we know that that's going to be critical to women reentering the workforce.
I'm curious, what are your thoughts? There's some areas, obviously schools, it's different depending on where you are in terms of whether things are fully back in person or they're full remote or obviously a hybrid, which is what's happening with my kid here in Massachusetts. What do you see as the big stumbling block right now to getting schools back open? Is it as simple as teacher vaccinations or is it something bigger than that?
It's something bigger than that.
Simple, by the way.
There's the lack of coordinated effort and strategy at the federal level and also at the state levels, and even trickling down to the local levels. I think many schools are in battles with unions, as we've seen across the country. Teachers don't feel safe coming back in without a clear plan for vaccinations, and rightfully so. So we really need to prioritize the health of the teachers and make sure that schools are safe for students to return and that we have a real, good plan to keep students healthy. Because I tell you, I'm a mother of 11-year-old twins. The worst thing that could happen right now is schools open and then 2 weeks later they close again. I think we need a clear strategy so that once schools open, they're able to stay open, so that parents, mothers can, go back to work, not have the uncertainty of schools closing again.
Do you believe, when you wrote that piece, the She Session piece last summer, part of that was kind of a forecast for the rest of 2020. When you look out at 2021, do you expect that our kids, your kids, my kid, they're going to be back in school 5 days a week in September?
You know what? I have to be honest. I told someone earlier, I said, I really don't have I'm not optimistic about them returning to school this year, but I'm really optimistic about them being able to return in the fall. I think if we can take between now and the fall to really get things together, get the pandemic under control, do what we need to do to upgrade schools so that they're safe for kids to return. I think parents will feel safe and comfortable and teachers will feel safe returning and schools will be able to reopen. In the meantime, we have. Mm-hmm.
No, continue. I'm sorry for cutting you off.
No. I want to hear what you have to say.
I was just going to ask, kind of as a piece that you talked about, particularly mothers at home, staying home with kids, and definitely even in two-parent households, a lot of the childcare has fallen more on women than on men, according to kind of every survey you read on this. Do you think the recession in general increased attention, might be the best way to say it, on kind of unpaid work, parenting and others who stay home and things they don't get compensated for?
Yeah, so absolutely. So before the pandemic, women were suffering in silence. So many of us were juggling really high demand careers and having to work outside of the home, but also still responsible for majority of the caretaking responsibilities. And with the pandemic, that burden doubled and tripled. And so now we're in the moment where we're having a conversation and we understand that this is unsustainable. We need a national childcare infrastructure where we treat childcare as a public good and people can access it regardless of their income or ability. And also, again, being able to calculate the cost of this unpaid care, because for a while, again, many women just did it and didn't say anything about it. But now we know that it is a real big responsibility that women have, bore for most families.
I wonder that's a really big conversation, and it's the sort of thing that I think when we all grew up, and if you ever read or saw Schoolhouse Rock, you thought that's the sort of stuff Congress works on, big issues, and they deal with it and they fix it. Given that so much of what the federal government and even state governments right now are dealing with seems to be putting out immediate fires, what gives you confidence that they're going to be able to successfully take on these kind of larger systemic issues like childcare that have been festering for decades, but have just happened to have more light shown on them in the past year?
Thanks for asking that question, because I do think that we need a two-pronged strategy. We need to be working at the federal level, but there's also a state level strategy that we should try to engage in passing some of these things at the state level and taking a page out of the playbook of many of the ballot referendums that have been passed over the last several years, paid sick leave, marijuana legalization, same-sex marriage. They were all ballot referendums and they all happened in the state first. So I think we need a two-pronged strategy when we think about rebuilding some of our infrastructure, especially around care.
So Nicole, you feel really that to deal with the child care issue, or for the feds to do it, it's going to have to start in the states first.
Yeah, I think we need to start there, and we have to broaden and think boldly about our strategies. I do believe that if, for example, child care was on the ballot in 2020, it would have passed unanimously. Parents like me, working families, really understand this as a really important issue, and we're ready to move on it.
Nicole Mason, the Institute for Women's Policy Research, thank you for joining Axios today.
Thank you so much.
And thank all of you also for joining this afternoon for another virtual conversation that has made us smarter, faster. And another thank you to our sponsor, Visa, for making this entire event possible. For more information or to sign up for my newsletter, Axios Pro Rata, please visit axios.com/newsletters or in the Axios app. And please be sure to join us a week from today, next Thursday, February 4th, for the Tampa Bay launch of our Axios Local Event Series, featuring a virtual conversation on the hospitality industry, economic recovery, and return to work in Tampa, just a couple days before the Super Bowl there. Thank you all again for joining, and we will see you on Axios.com.